Last week I came across this picture frame, and I knew that with a little bit of hard work and a little bit of patience, we could turn this into a beautiful picture frame terrarium. So let's get started. This picture frame consists out of a sheet of MDF and a plane of glass, and a few clips to hold everything together. So I'll have to use a few boards to build up the frame and give it some depth. First I want to remove these clips. This does slightly ruin the wood, but nobody will see this side anyway. Next I threw out the clips and stored the glass away for later. Then I cut up a few boards and attached them to the back. I attached these using a combination of wood glue and nails. I also glued and clamped a much smaller board in place in the bottom front of the frame. This will make sure the system can hold a little bit of water later on. The entire structure is left to dry for a few hours. Once everything dried, it was time to waterproof the inside. To do so, I used liquid rubber. This stuff is relatively cheap and very easy to apply. Using a paintbrush, you can easily seal any surface. However, this stuff alone won't seal seams. To cover those, I'm using seam tape. I like to cut all the pieces of seam tape I plan on using before getting started. With all the prep work done, I could get started. After applying a little bit of rubber, I realized I should have also taped off the edges I don't want to cover in rubber, so I quickly did. Once the entire structure looked like some kind of mummy, I got back to sealing the inside. With the inside covered, it was time to add the seam tape. It's important you do this while the first layer is still wet so it can get embedded into the rubber. You really want to press this stuff into place, and once it's there, cover it in another layer of rubber. This was left to dry for a few hours, after which I went back and added a second coat of rubber. In total I went with 3 coats and then left it to dry overnight. The next day I filled it with water to check for leaks. A few hours later there weren't any to be seen yet, so I continued. I removed the tape and sanded away any rubber that seeped under the tape. And at this point I realized I made a mistake. I've built up the frame on top of the back panel. And since it was the same size as the glass panel, this is now also the same size as the entire picture frame. This is a problem because now I don't have any way to attach it back on there. To work around this, I added another layer of wood around the frame. However, this time I decided to go with a slightly wider piece of wood, but still aligned with the front of the frame. This creates a void at the back of the frame, which will allow me to attach some hanging hardware later on. Which kind of turns this mistake into a blessing in disguise. My miter saw doesn't really make the most accurate cuts, and every now and then I end up with a few gaps between the boards. This really is a simple fix though. I just use a mixture of wood glue and sawdust to fill the gaps. As you can see, I added way too much, but I'll sand it away later on. While that's drying, it's time to make the frame that will hold the glass in place. I simply cut a few boards, glued them together, and added small hobby sticks along the outside edge. These will make up for the thickness of the glass. Once all of the wood glue had dried, it was time for my least favorite part: sanding. There were quite a few really big inconsistencies in the wood, so I started off with 80 grit sandpaper and slowly worked my way up to 180. All of this took me a few hours, but in the end it was all well worth it. Next I marked for some hinges and cut a groove for them to rest in. Next it's time to attach the hanging hardware. First I hammered in a little hook on the left side. Next I grabbed a length of wire, stuck both ends in my drill and twisted it together. Next I looped this twisted wire through a second hook and twisted it together again. This makes the wire significantly stronger, and it also already attached it to one of the hooks. Next I attached the second hook to the picture frame and finally partially untwisted the wire so I could retwist it around the first hook. All of this left me with a really strong wire on the back of the frame from which the entire terrarium can hang. Next I unscrewed the hinges, wiped down the entire frame with damp cloth and got to staining. Wiping it down with a damp cloth cleans off all the debris but also opens up the pores of the wood so it would better accept the stain. Once the stain dried, I took everything outside and also added a layer of varnish to protect the wood. With all of the woodworking out of the way, it's time to attach the glass. For that I'm using AutoSeal S28. This is an aquarium safe silicone and therefore also terrarium safe. But before I apply the silicone, I taped off any edges I don't want to be covered in silicone. Next I added a generous amount of silicone and laid the glass in place. I then went around and filled the gaps between the glass and the wood with more silicone. I put a little weight on top of the glass and left everything to cure for 24 hours. Once cured, I reinstalled the hinges. I then added a small lock to keep the door shut. Now all of that brings us up to this point. We now have a picture frame terrarium which we can open and design however we like. Now for those of you wondering, the inside dimensions of this thing are 5.5 centimeters by 24.5 centimeters by 27.5 centimeters. Which means this thing holds about 3.5 liters. Or just under 1 gallon. Now as you can see, I've selected quite a lot of hardscape materials. I've no idea what I want to do with this thing just yet, so I'd say let's figure it out together. We got some Oko dragonstone, some spider wood and a few cork flats. So my first idea is to just make some sort of rocky formation with these Oko stones. Maybe something along the edge like this. It could be rocky sides and there could be plants in the middle. Could this be cool? Let me close this thing up for a second. Oh, I see a problem. This piece is too tall. Alright, then we just can't use that one. Maybe with some cork involved, maybe that will be cool. Okay, now we have more of a story in here, but I don't like that this side is so flat. Not a big fan of this plan actually. What if we just get rid of the dragon roots all together and just go for there, or maybe this one should be like there. Maybe if we add a few pieces of this stuff, maybe it shouldn't be draping down but building up. Eventually I decided to go with this design. So I grabbed some black expanding foam and locked all the pieces together. The can that I'm using here was Expire. On the back it says you can use it up to 3 months after the initial use. And it's probably around 8 months ago when I first used this can. Needless to say, it was quite some work to get the foam out of there, but eventually I managed. I applied a layer onto the rubber and pressed the hardscape into place. Ideally, when you get a fresh can, you can just spray in between the rocks without moving anything, but in this case I had to go this route. I left all of this to cure overnight. The next day I carved away as much foam as possible. Next I cut out a piece of geotextile fabric and glued it to the top of the frame using superglue. Then I added a hand of terrarium substrate and folded the fabric over top. The fabric was glued down once more and even more substrate was added. The fabric was then cut to match the shape of the hardscape and tucked behind it. What we just created is a substrate layer that will stay in place even when we turn the terrarium upright. Next I filled the bottom of the terrarium with more substrate. Some damp sphagnum moss was placed around the hardscape. Now it's finally time to add some plants. I started off by adding a bunch of moss. I used a combination of fern moss, hypno moss and haircap moss. After all the moss was added, I added more detail using some smaller branches of the spiderwood. Next, it's time to add more plants. I began with a few cuttings of Ficus pumila and some Anubias nana petite. Next, I added a cutting of Fittonia white vein, Alternatera ricini mini and some trident Java ferns. To finish it off, I added some springtails to keep this setup free of mold. And then gave everything a good spray down. And there you go, my take on a DIY picture frame terrarium. I had a lot of fun building this one and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I've got a lot of other cool projects coming, so make sure you subscribe so you won't miss any of that. In the meantime, I recommend you watch this video next. I'll see you there.